So I just start. Fantastic. Greetings, everyone. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Luqman, co host of the radio show By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. Also, I am a member and a co organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace. I'm a co organizer of the Mid Atlantic region for the Black Alliance for Peace. And I am a member of the DC based organization Pan African Community Action. Thank you so much for giving me this platform, inviting me on this platform on such a momentous occasion, because I want to talk about how Western media legitimizes the suffering of colonized people through manufacturing consent for imperialist war. But I want to do it not so much by focusing on media examples specifically. I want to talk about how the media does it and use one African country as an example, and that country is Nigeria. First, I think we need to establish that capitalist multinational speculation and resource extraction of African nations create modern day colonies on which Africans are forced through lack of other viable means of subsistence to work for poverty wages under exploitative conditions for the mining and oil drilling operations of these multinational foreign countries. The Western nations that were the former colonial masters of these same African nations coordinate with US and other foreign and Western capitalist and political interests to solidify their political control over these operations by installing comprador leaders who are in league with the US controlled Western hegemony in Africa. But as history has shown, Africans were not disposed to silently endure colonial rule then and struggled for freedom against it, and today are not any less disposed to endure neo-colonial rule through foreign, Western-backed multinational corporations. As a response to this continued struggle, the installation and expansion of AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, and coordination with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that has never stayed in the North Atlantic, and marshaling the militaries of African states that are led by Western compradors, multinational Western entities have a ready army to defend their capitalist infrastructures throughout the continent. But those forces are also used to respond to the frequent uprisings of the exploited masses on the continent. But how does the rest of the world continue to ignore the tumult on the continent that these forces not only have not been able to contain, but that they've actually caused? Western media creates legitimacy for these neocolonial actions by perpetuating the idea that the militarism of Western nations throughout the continent exists as a response to jihadist extremism in Africa, while obscuring the true capitalist neo-colonial new scramble for Africa that is ongoing. And I think how we talk about the material wealth of the African continent, and it is a resource rich continent, is a part of this problem. Africa is a continent that contains 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 8% of the world's natural gas, and 12% of the world's oil reserves, 40% of the world's gold, and up to 90% of the world's chromium and platinum, as well as 65% of the world's arable land, 10% of the planet's internal renewable fresh water source, coltan that is needed for the electronic devices that we are accessing this event through in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo in particular, in abundance. But when we talk about Africa's wealth of resources, we often crouch these facts in conversations condemning the African nation's ability to marshal those resources to develop, or we center those conversations about those facts around condemning specifically and almost only the leadership of those African nations and how they enrich themselves using that wealth, but keep the people in their countries impoverished. Truly, only one of these conversations is even a valid conversation to have. But without the analysis of neo-colonial forces plundering the continent, supported by US and Western militarism, even the valid condemnation of comprador African leaders is a dangerously inaccurate starting point in this conversation about what is wrong with the African continent. So let's take Nigeria's oil wealth as an example. Oil was discovered, reportedly, in Nigeria in 1956, with production starting in the late 1950s, soon thereafter. In 1977, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, or the NNPC, was founded, and then this was a state-owned corporation that was supposed to regulate and participate in the country's oil business. So one would think that a state-owned oil entity would be able to provide stability and profit for the people of Nigeria through those oil profits. However, if we look at the nature of corporate involvement on the continent, we understand that even a state-run company like the NNPC has no real power. And this is because, as Mark P. Fancher points out in his July 2022 article in the publication Black Agenda Report, which I highly recommend you all read regularly. And that article of Mark Fancher's is called Oil and Imperialism in Africa. He points out that Professor Colin Lees observed, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Leys, Colin Lees, or maybe Leys, observed that the true nature of African government partnerships with foreign corporate entities do not actually bestow any power at all on those governments. In Professor Lee's book, Under Development in Kenya, he notes that, quote, in the case of oil refineries, no outward change from previous colonial control was apparent. In Kenya, that is. The existing, mainly expatriate top management was retrained. It was clear that the government was in a position to know more about the profits of oil distribution once it controlled the source of supply, and should thus be able to influence that stage of fuel pricing. However, the distributors still owned the wells and controlled the shipping of the oil to the refinery, and it is doubtful if control of the refineries really conferred on the government a significant power to determine the profitability of the oil companies of even the modest Kenya component of their total operations, end quote. So when we look at Nigeria, the case is the same as Lees pointed out in Kenya. This is also the case today, ongoing, as Lee said about Kenya in 1975. That's when his book, Under Development in Kenya, was published. Only today, the evidence, I think, is more stark. If you're not paying attention, not listening to the Western media and the reasons that they give us for Nigeria's continued struggles and Africa's as a whole. So also, as Fancher points out in his Black Agenda Report article, quote, it is good business for a corporation to work out arrangements that, through exploitation, result in higher profits. Measures that might ensure stability of local populations and environmental safety could be costly and adversely affect the bottom line of the corporations. And this is reflected, as we see, if we are not paying attention to what US and Western media is telling us about the instability in Nigeria and the reasons for it, if we understand and know about the actual utter environmental devastation that oil companies like ExxonMobil have caused in the oil-rich Niger Delta, the sheer and unparalleled environmental disaster that frequent oil spills by the various oil corporations, all foreign owned and controlled, have caused there, and the decimation of Nigerian waterways, farmland, and entire communities along them. Even as Africans in the Niger Delta have fought the oil companies by organizing and even through militant struggle, organizations like the Movement to Emancipate the Niger Delta, or MEND, which sometimes sabotaged oil company facilities and even abducted oil company personnel held responsible for the exploitation of the people and the destruction of their land. We in the West, and certainly in the US, we don't hear about any of that. The destruction and the damage that the oil companies are causing, have caused, and continue to cause, and the ongoing struggle of the African people, particularly in Nigeria, have been waging against them. What we hear about instead of all of the oil imperialism destroying the lives of Nigerians and perpetuating their poverty and exploitation for the obscene profits of wealthy nations that control the oil operations, what we hear about is the terrorism of Boko Haram and Islamic jihadists that need to be combated in Nigeria. Now, it's not that there is not a problem with the fringe fundamentalist Islamic extremist group in Nigeria, Boko Haram. But the problem has really never been one that has been connected to the often hyped up US global war on terror undertaken by George Bush in 2001 after the Saudi funded September 11 attacks on the US government. Boko Haram, you see, has always been an organization that has declared war on the government in Nigeria, as it has considered it corrupt and Western. And the organization even grew by offering security and stability, like providing food and support and shelter to people who were refugees from wars in neighboring Chad, started and fueled by Western US-backed militarism and imperialism for the control of resources there, and providing a safe haven and shelter for many jobless Nigerian youths. But the group's attacks, even though they were absolutely violent, usually targeted the Nigerian government and all too frequently those who opposed their fundamentalist ideology, with the exception of one attack that was carried out on the US Embassy in Nigeria, I believe. But even the United States Peace Institute's special report on Boko Haram and the rise of the organization, where it came from, what their demands are, who they target, they point out that in a 2004 US State Department cable that was revealed by WikiLeaks, that showed that the US Embassy in Abuja concluded that the group actually did not represent an international threat and likely had no links to international jihadist organizations. But we are told that Boko Haram is part of or has links to Al-Qaeda or ISIS now, and are therefore the justifiable targets of US-supported militarism in Nigeria. And that militarism is expansive and expensive for us in the US, and for as far as dollars are concerned, and for the lives of Nigerians, and has actually gone back long before Boko Haram even formally existed. The US State Department reports that, quote, for more than 50 years, the United States and Nigeria have enjoyed a strong security partnership and friendship. The US-Nigeria relationship is among the most important in sub-Saharan Africa, given Nigeria's status as Africa's most populous country, the largest economy, leading oil producer, and they throw in, because they have our shared democratic values. In fiscal year 2020, the United States authorized the permanent export of over $1.2 million in defense equipment to Nigeria through the direct commercial sales process. The top categories of DCS equipment to Nigeria were firearms, aircraft related articles, military training and equipment, military electronics, and fire control equipment. This is after the Department of State obligated $6 million in international military education training, or IMET is what they call it, funding for the Nigerian military. Oh, sorry, my power went out. I apologize about that. Let me make sure I am still connected with you. Woo! Whew, that was a little scary. Sorry about that. So this is after the Department of State obligated $6 million in international military education and training funding for the Nigerian military between 2016 and 2020. Nigeria is also a partner in the African Military Education Program, the AMEP, and has benefited from $1.1 million since fiscal year 2016 to support what the State Department calls instructor and or curriculum development at Nigerian military schools. From fiscal year 2016 to fiscal year 2020, $1.8 million was obligated for Nigeria in foreign military financing to support maritime security, military professionalism, and counterterrorism efforts. Nigeria is also an active member of the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, or the TSCTP. We love our acronyms in this imperialist state, and has benefited from $10.6 million worth of training, equipment, and advisory support for counterterrorism efforts between fiscal year 2017 and 2020. But let's be clear about what all of this money that the United States government is admitting to giving to Nigeria. It's not to support the democratic values of the country. And it's not really to fight terrorism either, because as we noted, Boko Haram didn't exist when the United States was involved or became involved in an active partnership with Nigeria more than 50 years ago. What the U.S. is interested in Nigeria for more than 50 years is, as the State Department clearly says, but embedded down in their explanation of their relationship with Nigeria, is the oil. Oil that was, remember, discovered in 1956, and production of that oil and oil exports by foreign companies, not by the Nigerian government, controlled by the UK, Nigeria's former colonial invaders, and the US soon afterward. So the hyped up international jihadist Islamic terrorist threat of Boko Haram and any other terrorist group the US tells us they are in Nigeria to defend against, that's really not the reason they're there. That's really not the reason of 50 plus years of US militarism in Nigeria and for US citizens to continue to support the expansion of it. Expansion that has included the establishment of AFRICOM, the US Africa Command, in 2007. But even before AFRICOM was established, we need to understand that the US was pushing militarism on the continent to protect the capitalist oil interests through the presence of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Last I checked, Nigeria is not in the North Atlantic, but their NATO was in Nigeria, which they admit they were involved with the African Union in a partnership with them since 2005, while the African Union itself has only been in existence since 2002. So knowing that the US and its international imperialist gang of thugs, NATO, that's what I call them because that's what they are, have been supporting the African Union and its 55 member countries since its establishment in 2002, and then that AFRICOM was established not too long after and has now spread its operations not just throughout Nigeria, with the full support of Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari, who incidentally was among the many African leaders who at first was vehemently opposed to AFRICOM's establishment and possible headquartering in the country in 2007, which is why The headquarters of AFRICOM are in Stuttgart, Germany today, and not on the continent. We must examine how we discuss, how we talk about the continued destabilization and underdevelopment of all African nations going forward, with all of this information that maybe a lot of us didn't have before because of the US media propaganda against Nigeria and African nations and African people in general, which leads us to some very wrong conclusions and some very wrong-headed conversations. So now that we have this information, we have to ask ourselves, before we enter into the discussion about what is wrong with Africa, is the US media-driven narrative of fighting radical Islamic terrorism really the problem in Nigeria or anywhere else on the continent? Is the problem in Nigeria and other African nations that the people do not know what to do with their vast mineral wealth and they just keep voting for bad leadership who do not know how to manage that wealth for the benefit of the people, as too many of us are led to conclude when we simply believe the narrative given to us from the US media? And that's where our conversations usually start. It's either with the truly comprador leaders that are propped up by the US government and its Western allies, but that's not where the conversation should start. Is the problem in Africa, in African countries, merely the existence of leaders like Buhari, who inexplicably seem to turn on a dime, seemingly, and support ongoing US militarism in their countries, while they present the sham of democracy, providing no real benefit to their people? And we see this in the constant uprising and the struggle against these governments of the people throughout the African continent, struggling for dignity, a living wage, not to be exploited, for the resources in their own land, for true liberation. I think it should be noted, since we are talking about Muhammadu Buhari, that he is now, in addition to supporting AFRICOM's presence in Nigeria and asking for more of it, also unveiled the new Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited just this week, I believe, which officially changes the oil firm from a wholly state-run entity to, guess what, a commercial oil company limited by shares, turning that state-run entity into an entirely capitalist venture. But is this merely a function of one individual leader's unbridled greed, as is the argument presented to us by the US media about African leaders in general? Or is the problem really the neo-colonial relationship that foreign oil and other mining corporations and capitalist interests perpetuate on the continent to this day, with the full protection of the US military to enforce the continued supplication of African leaders to the US and the West demands for the ongoing oppression, suppression, and exploitation of African resources and people? This is clearly the case, even as we can accurately condemn individual leaders' actions. Because while we're bombarded with reports about Boko Haram, and if the US media ever does talk about African nations like Nigeria, we do not hear about how Africans in the Niger Delta have, struggled against these oil giants. We don't hear about MEND at all and their militant resistance that they've been waging against oil imperialism and US imperialism since 2006 in an organized fashion. We don't even hear about the continued and recent struggles against oil imperialism going on in Nigeria, as evidenced in the protests of the 2-day African Energy Summit that was held last week, I think, again at the swanky Mayfair Hotel in London. Just this past May. Rob Callender, a member of the Jubilee for Climate organization, said, quote, "Oil companies need to get out of Africa, as our partners on the continent have been saying. They're calling on rich nations like the UK to cancel the debt, which is like a knee on the neck, forcing governments to extract anything and everything just to service obscene levels of unjust debt, leaving nothing for the kind of development that benefits the people. Further, Kathy Allen, a member of Extinction Rebellion Global Report, said, quote, "What's happening here in Nigeria is unregulated oil companies signing exploitative new oil deals with debt-burdened African nations, which need to cope with not only the pollution of oil exploration in their country, but the global effects of oil exploration, the droughts, the floods, the food insecurity, the displacement, and the conflict that is fueled by U.S. militarism and imperialism." This is not a conference, this African Energy Summit. She said it's a crime scene disguised as a party. In fact, Francher points out in his Black Agenda Report article that it was actually the African environmental group MEND and their activities that may have contributed to the decision to establish AFRICOM, the US and its allies' decision to establish AFRICOM, not the response to any growing internal or international jihadist terrorist threat, as we are so often told. African nations need to be kept under the control of Western capitalist countries, the rich countries of the world, who are the former colonial powers that carved Africa up as theirs at the Berlin Conference in the first place, that continue to exploit her for her resource wealth. The African people constantly struggling against this ongoing neo-colonialism and oil and resource imperialism need to constantly be kept in line to keep them from doing exactly what Africans have been demanding for and struggling to achieve for decades, forcing the Western capitalist exploiters out of their countries. So just by looking at one African nation, Nigeria, I hope that we see how our consent for US militarism throughout Africa and the imperialist wars that it continues to perpetuate is literally manufactured by continually feeding us the lies that the US military presence on the African continent is justified and needed to fight unhinged, insane, irrational, and violent, expanding African fundamentalist Islamic terrorists there, or worse, to provide humanitarian support that we are never told is actually in response to the instability stoked by US militarism that all protects capitalist dictatorship on the continent. And it all keeps us questioning the intelligence, the dignity, and the very right to self-determination and self-governance of our African brothers and sisters who are fighting US and foreign powers. And that keeps us from ever focusing on the actual source of it all, capitalist greed and US imperialism that protects it. As a final note, the defense and support of the African struggle against US militarism and imperialist war in support of capitalist dictatorship throughout the continent is directly connected to what we Africans in the US, in the diaspora, are suffering because the manufacturing of consent for domestic militarism, the continued militarism in Haiti, the continued militarism in the global South, unleashed against working class, poor, oppressed, and colonized African and other non-European descended people here is done exactly the same way through propaganda against those people disseminated by the State Department run media. That's work, Colin. The militarization of U.S. police forces through the coordination between them and the U.S. Department of Defense's 1033 program, where state, local, and even college campus police here in the U.S., their forces are either given or sold at bargain basement prices, cast off battlefield military equipment. That is a direct reflection of the struggle against the same forces on the continent that our African brothers and sisters are engaged in. So we do not win our domestic struggle against US imperialism in defense of capitalist dictatorship here without joining in the struggle the international struggle, fighting against it. And that starts on the continent of Africa, but it certainly does not end there. So I want to thank you so very much for the opportunity to express my solidarity with my African brothers and sisters in Nigeria and throughout the continent in this our shared struggle for our total liberation, for all of our people, to free us from the capitalist dictatorship that is backed by US militarism that we have absolutely been propagandized to consent to through the US controlled and run media that constantly lies about the struggle of our brothers and sisters on the continent and throughout the world. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate you. Peace.